Harvard Divinity School.
100 Years Rudolf Steiner, December 15th and 16th, 2025.
Hello, dear friends and unknown friends. And thank you, Katie. I'm happy to be going after you because I think our pieces fit together very nicely. Greetings. I'm going to jump right in right now. Although I will say that I had about 14 drafts going and I wish I could read them all at once. And I think that speaks to kind of what I'm talking about in this, which is this fluidity rather than an ossification. And I think that you'll find how that's relevant from what I read. But first, I'm going to start with some poetry. First, some Shelley from his poem, Adonais. Heaven's light forever shine, earth's shadows fly. Life, like a dome of many-colored glass, stains the white radiance of eternity, until death tramples it to fragments. Die, if thou wouldest be with that which thou dost seek. At the heart of what I want to propose is simple and perhaps unsettling. Anthroposophy is anarchic in essence. Not anarchic as mere negation, not the romance of chaos, and certainly not the propaganda of the deed, but anarchic as the decentralization of moral and cognitive authority, the conviction that freedom cannot be administered from above, because it is born only where thinking becomes living, inwardly active, and ethically responsible. Nature itself offers an image of this. In living systems, order does not need to be imposed from a single center. Complex coordination emerges from countless local interactions. Cells composing organs, organs composing organisms, ecosystems regulating themselves through reciprocity and feedback. What looks like from a distance governance is often the outcome of participation, relation answering to relation. Without a sovereign blueprint, anarchist thought at its most serious wagers the same possibility in human affairs, that social order, when freed from coercive hierarchy, can arise organically through cooperation, mutual recognition, and lived responsiveness rather than centralized command. Give me a second, I need my glasses, it got dark in here. And here the thread runs straight through Christianity itself. Christ's new commandment is not a tighter law, but a loosening of law, a deliberate reduction of the moral code to a single seed, so that the sacred can no longer be monopolized by temple, by priest, or statute, but must be grown in each human being as living spirit. Steiner's epistemology makes this move intelligible. Thinking, when experienced in its own self-sustaining reality, is already our first encounter with spirit. And Steiner's ethics radicalizes it. Moral ideas are not received as commands from beyond, but are free creations of the individual. So freedom is possible only as ethical individualism. In that sense, the masters love one another, decentralizes the sacred. It refuses to specify the deed in advance, because the deed must be born anew out of moral intuition, immersed in love, in the living situation itself. And that leads to what I want to hold with you today. Did Steiner, and this is a reframing of the question that our panel is addressing, did Steiner attempt to transform democracy from a statist form of representation into an emergent, self-organizing process of spiritual individuation and mutual recognition? If we put it that way, anthroposophical anarchism stops sounding like a provocation and starts naming a wager that free spiritual activity and genuine democracy belong together, and that both are distorted when they're squeezed into the machinery of the modern rights state. I'm starting from a tension, and I don't want to resolve it too quickly. On the one side, Steiner's critics, anthroposophy seen as a social bourgeois movement, sociologically, culturally, often politically, and racially insensitive. But on the other side, we have Steiner founding a school for factory workers' children, corresponding with an individualist anarchist about violence in the state in 1898, and proposing a threefold social order that would, if taken seriously, strip the modern state of most of what it thinks it is. So the question is not whether Steiner was secretly a revolutionary in disguise. The question is whether, in his concept of freedom and his experiments in education and social form, he was trying to push democracy beyond representation towards something more like a living, self-organizing process of spiritual individuation and mutual recognition. To get at that, we have to start at the philosophy of freedom, which is where he starts. And Steiner's free spirit is a human being whose deeds arise from individual moral intuition, not from obedience to law, custom, or external authority. Moral intuition, as he describes it, is not a mood or a hunch. It's what happens when thinking becomes so inwardly awake that it can grasp, in a concrete situation, this deed as the right one. Thinking for Steiner here is not rearranging of dead concepts. It's a creative act. When I really think, I don't just mirror the world, I participate in it. I take up perceptions, but I also bring something that was not there without me. Concepts, relations, meaning. In the ethical sphere, the same holds. I don't simply apply a prefabricated rule to a case. I see intuitively what the situation asks of me, and my deed is free to the extent that it arises from that seeing. Already, this has political ramification. If the genuinely moral deed arises from individual intuition, then no church, party, or state, or society can claim the last word about the good. At best, institutions can create conditions in which such intuition can flourish. At worst, they usurp it and become machines for heteronomy. If we now say democracy, we usually mean a procedure, representation, elections, constitutional rights. Steiner is asking a different question. What kind of order is worthy of free spirits? And that means what kind of democracy would actually recognize individuals as sources of moral and cognitive initiative rather than as units to be aggregated? Behind this stands the work of Franz Brentano, who Steiner and many of his contemporaries, such as the founder of phenomenology, Edmund Husserl, studied with in Vienna. In his book, The Origin of the Knowledge of Right and Wrong, Brentano divides inner life into presentations, judgments, and what he calls phenomena of love and hate. Our acts of approval and disapproval, attraction and aversion. For him, there is such a thing as evident value. Some acts of love and hate are correct in the same way that some judgments are evident. Ethical law is not handed down from outside, and it's not just private taste. It has what he calls a natural sanction in the structure of consciousness itself. Steiner takes that and radicalizes it. Where Brentano describes inner evidence, Steiner builds a practice on it. Educate thinking and feeling until you can trust that evidence and then act from it. Ethical individual is not everyone does what they like. It is each person learning to hear in their own activity of thinking what Brentano would have called the correct love, and then taking responsibility for it. A generation later, Husserl tries to describe with great care how meanings and objects are given to consciousness. In phenomenology, the subject is not just a container for impressions. It becomes the origin of meaning through disciplined intuition, appearances, how things, just our direct experience of reality. That's what the phenomenological mission was. Steiner shared that basic mood, but he pushed it further. For him, thinking is not only the place where meaning is constituted, it's already a spiritual activity. When I practice pure inner thinking of the kind he describes in the Philosophy of Freedom, I'm not just arranging concepts behind my forehead. I am participating in the reality that is objective in its own way as sense perception. When that thinking intensifies into what he calls intuition, the gods spoken about. Anyway, I'll just go on from here. If moral and cognitive authority are grounded in this inner evidential space, if the human eye is where both meanings and moral intuitions arise, then any claim to absolute authority from outside, from statute, from dogma, from the state, becomes at least suspect. And this is the philosophical ground for reading Steiner's Politics as a critique of domination. And it's also the bridge to his social ideas. If consciousness is this kind of origin, then social forms must be shaped so that such consciousness can actually breathe. And that's where threefolding and things like Waldorf pedagogy come in, not as add-ons to his philosophy, but as attempts to build institutions that give this free, intentional subjectivity real room to move. And here's a little story that I got from the Das Goethean website. In 1898, and I think this kind of helps explain why I use the word anarchist with for Rudolf Steiner. Other than the late 1800s, early 1900s in the social movements, they were huge around the world, from China to the United States, anarchist movements. People were exploring the ideas of whether we actually even needed a state, you know. So there was a famous anarchist by the name of John Mackay from Scotland, and he was friends with Rudolf Steiner. They were good friends, actually. And Mackay writes a letter to Steiner because these bombings have been, particularly an Italian anarchist assassinated Empress Elizabeth Mackay. And Mackay asks, because he's defended that violent anarchists while rejecting their tactics. He fears he's going to be thrown out of Germany. So he asks Steiner, who is editing the magazine for literature, for help. And this appears in GA 31, Individualist Anarchism, an opponent of the propaganda of the deed. Steiner replies, And he distances himself clearly from bomb throwing, but he also affirms a strain of anarchism by calling himself, if he had to give himself a label, an individualist anarchist that insists on the sovereignty of the individual and distrusts the state precisely because it tends to treat persons as means. But at the same time, we get the strange story of the desk fire. So Steiner's desk catches on fire in 1898. And this letter that is in the archives still exists, but it's charred along the edges. I wish I had a slide for you. It's an amazing document that really is a foreshadowing of things to come. Thank you. 3 minutes, are you kidding me? Okay, well, so this letter is a foreshadowing of the fire that's to come, I believe. And it's just the moment that Steiner is venturing into another way of relating to the public sphere and politics, okay? And it's a sad story, I think. But before I do that, I wanna just look at the Marseille Tarot, 2 images, the star and the tower. And I get a lot of inspiration for this from Valentin Tomberg's meditations on the tarot. The star shows a naked figure kneeling by a pool, pouring water from 2 vessels, one into the pool, one onto the earth. Spirit here is not hoarded, it's poured out into the soul and into the world. And the tower shows a crown-topped building struck by lightning, figures falling, masonry blown apart. It's an image of hardened gnosis, of spiritual power turned into rigid form, and its eventual undoing. So if we look at the 2 Goetheanums through the tower and the star, the first Goetheanum, carved in wood with its double dome and its vulnerable, perishable surface, is a star building, an organ for living thinking, designed to be inhabited, improvised within, and if need be, lost. It is architecture as process, an experiment in how far a building can be an extension of thinking rather than a monument to it. The second Goetheanum, poured in concrete after Steiner's death, though designed by Steiner, risks being a tower building, massive, enduring, sheltering a movement that is already hardening into bureaucracy. It becomes the center of a society increasingly concerned with guarding Steiner's legacy, issuing correct readings, managing the archive. Both are far more subtle than these caricatures, but as images, they track something real, a shift from fluid, exposed, experimental form towards solidity, protection, authority. From an anthroposophy that is still trying to find its shape to an anthroposophical society that knows or thinks it knows what anthroposophy is. Okay, so I'm just going to close right now. In Steiner's larger cosmology, this social experiment of threefolding mirrors something happening from above. The higher beings, who in his language constitute the spiritual hierarchies, do not coerce. They self-limit to make room for human freedom. The self-limitation of the spiritual hierarchies from above is meant to be mirrored from below in the self-limitation of the human eye, ethical intuition born of living thinking, so that freedom becomes a two-way traffic, a feedback loop, if you will, a gift from the gods that returns to them as a freely given deed. If Steiner did, however, partially and contradictorily attempt to transform democracy into an emergent process of spiritual individuation and mutual recognition, then anthroposophical anarchy names the work of taking that attempt seriously now. It means letting his free spirit philosophy, his Brentano-colored ethics, his threefolding, and his worker Waldorf gesture to criticize not just the state out there, but our own anthroposophical habits, our institutions, our schools, our conferences, our class positions. It means asking very concretely, where today are the star spaces, those fragile, exposed, co-creative spaces where thinking is still alive and persons can actually recognize one another. Thank you.
Sponsored by the Program for the Evolution of Spirituality.
Copyright 2023, the Preston Fellows of Harvard College.